Welcome to Void Histories. Here, we do not hurry through the pages of time. We move slowly, quietly, through stories that linger like shadows at the edge of memory. Tonight, we turn to a tale both fierce and sorrowful. The Zulu Wars, Spears Against Empire. It is not only the story of spears raised against rifles, but of dignity tested, of wounds carved into families and land, of a people who carried both pride and loss beneath the weight of empire. History is more than battles and dates. It is memory. It is the echo of voices, the silence of absence, the lessons that still whisper to us across generations. So rest easy and let the rhythm of these words guide you deeper into reflection. Stay with us as we walk gently into the past and listen to what it still has to teach. The Zulu Wars, Spears Against Empire. Before the redcoats of empire set foot upon the rolling hills of southern Africa, there was a land breathing in harmony with itself, a land of wide horizons, where the morning sun spread its golden light over grasslands dotted with acacia trees, and the rivers moved quietly, nourishing the valleys and the lives that depended on them. Here stood the Zulu kingdom, strong and proud, a society that had grown through discipline, unity, and the wisdom of its leaders. To be Zulu was not simply to belong to a tribe, it was to belong to a way of life, to a rhythm that honored ancestors and looked with dignity toward the future. In the villages, cattle were more than wealth. They were symbols of status, connection, and lineage. Warriors trained in the art of the spear and the shield, not merely as soldiers, but as guardians of their people, defenders of the land. Songs carried across the hills in the evenings, voices rising and falling with the beat of drums, weaving together memory and identity. Elders told stories by firelight, speaking of origins, of battles past, of spirits watching from beyond. Children grew up in this world of belonging, learning that life was not lived alone, but in connection, with kin, with community, with land. The kingdom had known its share of conflict, yet it was conflict shaped by familiar hands, guided by the ebb and flow of regional rivalries. Under leaders like Shaka, the Zulu had risen to great power, reorganizing their armies, refining their strategies, and uniting clans under one banner. Through discipline and courage, they carved out a place of respect and fear among neighboring peoples. But for all their strength, their vision was rooted in their soil, in their cattle, in their ancestors. They sought not empire across oceans, but balance and security within their homeland. Life, before the storm of foreign ambition arrived, was a life of cycles. The seasons carried their rhythm of rain and drought, of harvest and hunger, of growth and rest. People lived close to the land, shaping it and being shaped by it in return. The Zulu kingdom was alive with its own pulse, and it was into this pulse that the first quiet ripples of change began to creep. Far beyond the horizon, empires were already stirring. The British, with their ships, their rifles, and their hunger for dominion, were expanding across continents. To them, the Zulu lands were not sacred or ancestral, but strategic, territory to be measured, mapped, and claimed. The land that carried memory was to be reduced to lines on paper, boundaries drawn not by those who lived there, but by those who sought to rule from afar. And so, the stillness of the plains held within it the foreshadowing of storm. The rivers continued to run, the drums continued to beat, the cattle continued to graze. Yet on the wind, there was already a whisper of change, of sails approaching, of treaties written in foreign tongues, of soldiers who did not know the rhythm of the land, but carried the weight of empire upon their shoulders. For now, peace still reigned. The fires still burned at night, and the voices of the Zulu people still carried through the valleys, strong and unwavering. But history was already turning its gaze toward this kingdom, and the days of quiet balance were numbered. It is here, at the threshold of change, that our story begins. A story of spears raised against rifles, of dignity against dominion, of a people whose spirit would be tested by one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. At first, the arrival of the British in southern Africa did not seem like the strike of a storm. It began quietly, almost gently, like ripples spreading across a still pool. Ships came to the harbors, carrying traders, missionaries, and soldiers who looked upon the land with eyes both curious and calculating. Their presence was not immediately marked by war, but by conversations, by exchanges of goods, and by words wrapped in the delicate cloth of diplomacy. To many, they seemed like visitors who wished only to settle, to trade, to share. But beneath this surface lay intentions that were heavier, intentions shaped by the expanding hunger of empire. The Zulu watched with caution. They were no strangers to power, no strangers to discipline, and they understood that no presence was without purpose. At first, there was curiosity toward the foreigners, their clothes, their weapons, their ways. But curiosity soon became unease, for it became clear that these newcomers did not see the land as the Zulu did. To the Zulu, the land was ancestral, sacred, inseparable from life. To the British, it was something to be measured, claimed, divided, and controlled. This difference in vision was like a crack beneath the surface, small at first, but destined to spread. The missionaries came with promises of salvation, their words gentle, their tone persuasive. They spoke of a God who demanded loyalty beyond the ancestors, a God foreign to the soil and the spirits of the Zulu. For some, these teachings offered curiosity, for others, confusion. But behind the missionaries often stood soldiers, and behind the soldiers stood administrators, all serving the same expanding empire. And with them came maps. Maps that turned valleys, rivers, and grazing lands into lines and borders, drawn without the consent of those who had always lived there. It was not only words and maps that shifted the balance, but also cattle, the very heart of Zulu wealth and livelihood. Disputes over grazing land began to grow. Disputes not only between neighbors, but between the Zulu and the settlers, who claimed pieces of land as their own. Small conflicts flared, sometimes settled with uneasy truces, other times leaving behind bitterness. The balance of the land, once guided by the cycles of nature, now bent under the weight of claims made by foreign law. As the British expanded their foothold, their presence grew heavier. Forts were built, soldiers drilled, and laws were declared that disregarded the authority of the Zulu king. The kingdom, once whole and strong, found itself pressed on its borders, its sovereignty questioned, its people tested. The British spoke of treaties, yet these treaties were not made in equality. They carried conditions, subtle at first, but binding. What was given with one hand was often taken with the other. The Zulu, proud and cautious, could feel the tightening of the rope. It was as if a slow fire was being lit around them, not yet burning, but spreading quietly, inch by inch. The drums of the kingdom still beat with strength, the warriors still trained with their spears, but the whispers of unease were growing louder. Elders spoke of the changing times, of the need to be wary, of the need to prepare for storms not yet visible but certain to come. And so, the beginning of conflict was not a sudden clash of armies, but a slow erosion of trust, of sovereignty, of balance. It began with words, with maps, with laws, with subtle shifts that pressed the Zulu further into a corner. It began with the creeping realization that these visitors were not content to share, but intended to rule. By the time the first sparks of war would ignite, the ground had already been prepared. The soil of mistrust was deep, the seeds of resentment had been planted, and the storm of empire was already gathering on the horizon. Conflict, once only a whisper on the wind, soon became a drumbeat echoing across the hills. The British, pressing further into Zulu lands, demanded submission to laws not their own. The kingdom, proud and unbroken, could not simply bow. When the demands grew too sharp, when the insult to sovereignty became too deep, the Zulu knew that words could no longer hold the storm at bay. The time for resistance had come. The warriors of the kingdom gathered under their king, their spears and shields gleaming in the sun, their voices rising in songs of defiance. They were not merely soldiers, they were sons and brothers, fathers and husbands, bound by loyalty to their king and to their people. Their training was disciplined, their movements precise, their courage unwavering. For generations, the Zulu had perfected the art of war on their plains, moving with speed, with cunning, with unity. Against their assegai spears and cowhide shields now stood the rifles and cannons of empire. It was an uneven contest, yet the Zulu spirit burned bright. The first great clash came at Isandlwana, a battle that would send shock waves across the empire. On that day, the hills trembled with the roar of thousands of warriors surging forward in unison, their battle cries rising like thunder. The British, armed and confident, believed their discipline would hold, but the Zulu encircled them with a strategy honed by generations, the famous horns of the buffalo formation, closing in from all sides until escape was impossible. The redcoats, caught in confusion, fell in great numbers. For a moment, empire itself staggered, humbled by a people armed not with machines, but with courage, precision, and will. This victory was more than military. It was spiritual. It was proof that the Zulu, though pressed by empire, were not powerless. Around the fires that night, stories of Isandlwana spread with awe and pride. The drums beat louder, the songs carried higher, and hope was renewed. For one shining moment, it seemed that spears could hold back rifles, that unity could resist conquest. Yet hope, though powerful, could not stop the weight of empire for long. The British, stung by their defeat, returned with greater numbers, with heavier weapons, with a resolve sharpened by humiliation. At Rorke's Drift, a small garrison of British soldiers held against waves of Zulu attacks, their rifles cutting through the night, and from then on, the tide began to shift. Each victory won by the Zulu was answered with reprisals fiercer still. Each success met with an empire unwilling to accept defeat. For the warriors, the first wars were not only fought on battlefields, they were fought in their hearts, in the quiet knowledge that they were standing against one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. And yet, they fought. They fought because the land was theirs, because the ancestors demanded courage, because dignity itself was at stake. The fields where cattle once grazed became scarred with blood. The rivers that once sang quietly through the valleys now carried whispers of sorrow. Families waited at night for sons who would not return, for fathers who had fallen, for brothers who had disappeared into the storm of battle. The price of resistance was heavy, but the alternative, the loss of sovereignty, the surrender of dignity, was heavier still. The first wars left both pride and pain in their wake. Pride, because the Zulu had shown the world their strength, had carved their name into history with fire and steel. Pain, because even in victory, they could see the gathering storm, the empire regrouping, stronger, determined to press further. And so, as the fires of the first wars dimmed into smoke, the Zulu carried both triumph and sorrow in their hearts. They had resisted, they had struck blows that would be remembered for generations, but they knew the struggle was far from over. The empire would not relent. The battles ahead would be longer, harsher, and filled with choices that would wound the kingdom deeply. The drums still beat, but their rhythm now carried both defiance and foreboding. The story of resistance was not ending, it was only beginning. The victory at Isandwana was a blaze of light in the darkness, a moment when the Zulu stood tall against an empire that believed itself untouchable. Yet, as all fires do, it brought not only warmth but also consequence. The British, humiliated and shaken, refused to let the memory of defeat linger. From across the seas came reinforcements, ships filled with soldiers, rifles, and cannons, carrying the weight of a vast empire determined to reclaim its pride. What had begun as a clash on the borderlands was now to become a prolonged war, stretching across the valleys and ridges of Zululand, leaving behind scars that would not easily heal. The battles that followed were relentless. The empire fought not only with soldiers but with strategy, pressing forward step by step, tightening its hold. The Zulu, brave and disciplined, resisted as best they could, but each clash brought heavy loss. The assegai's spear, though swift and skilled hands, could not forever match the reach of the rifle or the thunder of artillery. Fields that once nourished cattle now bore the blackened marks of gunpowder. Villages once filled with song and laughter became places of mourning. The rhythm of daily life was disrupted, turned into a cycle of fear, retreat, and resilience. The British struck not only at armies but at the heart of the kingdom itself. They sought to dismantle the unity that had long been the source of Zulu strength. They divided the land, split loyalties, and offered promises to some while punishing others. It was a war not only of weapons, but of patience and pressure, a slow suffocation meant to weaken the kingdom from within. When the Zulu could not be defeated swiftly, the empire turned to treaties. These documents, written in the foreign tongues, carried terms that were less agreements than declarations of submission. Land was ceded, authority was fractured, and the once unified kingdom was carved into smaller chiefdoms, each easier to control. The treaties offered the illusion of peace, but beneath their words lay the quiet triumph of conquest. For the Zulu, they were not peace at all. They were wounds written in ink, binding them not with honor but with humiliation. The pain of these agreements was not felt only in the halls of leaders, but in the lives of ordinary people. Families who had once relied on their land now found their grazing grounds diminished. Cattle were seized, villages uprooted, traditions disrupted. The treaties stripped away not just territory, but dignity, the sense that the Zulu were masters of their own fate. Each clause signed under duress was like a chain, invisible but heavy, binding the future of generations yet to come. And yet, even in these dark years, resistance did not vanish entirely. In the forests and hills, small bands of warriors still rose, refusing to accept defeat. Some chiefs defied the imposed order, holding fast to the memory of sovereignty. The drums, though quieter, still spoke in secret, reminding the people of who they were and what they had lost. The fire of identity could not be extinguished completely, even when treaties sought to bury it beneath foreign rule. The prolonged wars had drained the strength of the kingdom, but they had also revealed its resilience. The Zulu had stood against one of the mightiest empires of the age, and though their spears could not forever withstand rifles, they had written their defiance into history. The treaties may have marked the end of open conflict, but they were not the end of the story. They were instead the beginning of a new chapter, one of survival under foreign rule, of wounds carried in silence, of memory preserved in whispers. As the ink of these painful treaties dried, the land itself seemed to mourn. The rivers flowed as they always had, but their songs carried sorrow. The hills stood as they had for centuries, but they now bore witness to a kingdom divided, its unity broken, its spirit tested. And yet, beneath the weight of loss, there lingered a quiet truth. The Zulu were not erased, they endured. And so, the wars left behind not only scars, but lessons. Lessons of pride and pain, of courage and cost, of the fragility of peace when written by the hand of conquest. The empire may have declared victory, but the memory of resistance lived on, carried in the hearts of those who had fought and those who would one day tell their story. When the clash of battles faded and the treaties had been signed, the echoes of war did not simply vanish into silence. Instead, they lingered in the lives of ordinary people, in the daily rhythms that could no longer return to what they once had been. The Zulu kingdom, once whole and proud, now carried wounds deeper than those left on the battlefield. These were the wounds of society itself, fractures in families, in traditions, in the hearts of a people who had endured loss beyond counting. For the families left behind, the war had taken more than sons and fathers. It had stolen stability. Women who once tended cattle in fields with the support of husbands now bore the burden alone. Mothers raised children without the voices of their partners by their side. Grandparents looked into the eyes of grandchildren who would never know the pride of seeing their fathers return from battle. The homesteads, once alive with laughter and the strength of community, now echoed with absence. Children born into this era inherited not only land diminished by conquest, but also stories heavy with sorrow. They grew up with fragments of the past, memories of a kingdom that had stood tall, told to them in whispers by elders around the fire. Yet, at the same time, they were shaped by a reality where their future was bound by treaties written in foreign ink. Their games were quieter, their songs more subdued. They carried a weight they did not choose, the inheritance of a struggle that had robbed them of innocence. The social fabric of the Zulu was also strained by division. Where once the kingdom had stood as a single force, foreign influence fractured its unity. Chiefs were pitted against one another, loyalties split by the demands of empire. Old structures of authority, which had once guided life with balance and order, were disrupted. Confusion grew where certainty once stood. People who had been bound by the strength of a kingdom now found themselves scattered, their unity weakened not by choice but by design. Cattle, long the heart of Zulu society, also bore the mark of war. Herds had been seized, grazing grounds diminished. With cattle went wealth, pride, and the foundation of social stability. Without them, marriages were harder to secure, feasts fewer, rituals disrupted. The rhythms of life tied to cattle, birth, union, death, were fractured. What had once been a symbol of continuity now reflected loss. Yet, even in these wounds, resilience found a way to endure. Families clung to rituals that survived, passing down songs and dances in secret, even when discouraged by the watchful eye of colonial rule. Elders preserved language and memory, whispering stories of great battles and noble kings to young ears eager for belonging. Women, carrying burdens heavy with both grief and strength, became keepers of continuity, ensuring that what could not be preserved in land or cattle might still live on in memory and tradition. But the pain of lost generations could not be ignored. These were children who grew without knowing sovereignty, who learned the world through the lens of subjugation. They were generations who inherited scars without ever standing on the battlefield, who carried silence in their songs and caution in their laughter. Theirs was a life lived in the shadow of empire, where dignity was not taken completely, but dimmed, hidden, tested. The social wounds of the Zulu Wars did not fade with time. They seeped into the veins of the community, shaping how people saw themselves, how they trusted, how they dreamed. The losses of war were not counted only in numbers fallen, but in the slow unraveling of a society's fabric. This unraveling, though resisted with resilience, still left threads hanging loose, threads that even generations later could not be easily woven back into wholeness. And so, the wars left not only scars in the earth where battles were fought, but scars in the souls of those who lived through them and in the futures of those who would follow. They were the lost generations, not forgotten, but shaped forever by the sorrow of an empire's conquest. The fields may have grown green again, the rivers may have continued their endless flow, but beneath the surface, the silence of absence remained. And that silence would echo for years to come, carried across generations as both warning and memory. When the smoke of battle finally drifted away, and the treaties were etched into paper that carried more weight than the voices of a kingdom, what remained was not victory, but silence. The hills of Zululand, once alive with the sound of drums and cattle, stood as quiet witnesses to a past that could not be returned. The Zulu Wars had ended, but their echoes lingered in the hearts of survivors, in the stories of elders, in the unspoken grief of those who had lost too much to ever be the same. History often remembers wars in terms of battles won or lost, in numbers and treaties, in names of generals and kings. But beneath those records lies a deeper truth: the human cost, the lives altered, the dignity tested. The Zulu Wars were not merely a clash of spears and rifles, of empire and kingdom. They were the testing of spirit, the enduring of sorrow, the quiet resilience of a people who refused to let their identity be erased, even when pressed beneath the weight of empire. For the British, the war was another step in the march of expansion, another chapter in the story of dominion. But for the Zulu, it was a rupture, a fracture in the continuity of life that had flowed for generations. The treaties that followed were not lines of peace, but scars carved into sovereignty, and those scars would last, shaping lives long after the cannons fell silent. Yet within the sorrow, there remained something unbroken. Though the kingdom was divided, though its unity was strained, the memory of resistance could not be erased. Isandwana, with its thunderous defiance, would live on in song and story, told by firesides, whispered into the ears of children, carried like a quiet ember through the years. That ember was dignity, the kind that cannot be signed away, the kind that survives even when the world seeks to diminish it. The Zulu Wars remind us that history is not only about conquest, it is about memory. It is about the wounds that remain after treaties are signed, and the lessons that echo in the silence of loss. They remind us that the strength of a people is not measured only in weapons, but in their ability to endure, to carry forward their identity, even when stripped of land, wealth, and power. As we reflect, we see how the past lingers within the present. The social wounds, the lost generations, the fractured unity, they ripple forward, shaping culture, shaping identity, shaping how a people understand themselves in the world. History does not simply vanish with time, it settles into memory, into tradition, into the quiet places of the soul. And so, tonight, as we let this story settle into stillness, we hold in our hearts the truth it carries, that every empire leaves behind shadows, and every shadow tells us not only of loss, but of resilience. The Zulu, though pressed by one of the greatest empires in history, were never erased. They lived, they endured, they remembered, and in their memory lies a lesson for us all, that dignity may be tested, but it cannot be destroyed. Let this story, then, not be one of despair, but of reflection. Let it remind us that the human spirit is capable of enduring more than conquest, more than sorrow, and let it whisper to us gently as we drift into the quiet of night, that within every wound there is also memory, and within every memory there is the possibility of healing. The Zulu Wars are over, but their lessons remain, and in the silence of history, in the soft echo of drums that still seem to carry across the hills, we find not only the weight of the past, but the light of remembrance